Outboard prices have climbed, and the gap between great on a brochure and great to live with keeps widening. So I stopped taking advice from spec sheets and started listening to the people who see the failures first. I asked 20 working marine mechanics one question. If it was your own money, what outboard would you actually buy? What surprised me was not just the answers, but the hesitation behind them, the way certain choices came with quiet warnings, and the way a few engines earned trust without needing any hype. This countdown is 10 specific outboard models that mechanics kept circling back to, and surprisingly, some of them are underdog picks that rarely get said out loud. Number 10, Mercury 94, stroke inline 4. Most buyers think reliability is a feature you purchase. Mechanics know it is a pattern you either inherit or pay for later. When I asked the question, the first few responses sounded almost boring. Keep it simple, keep it serviceable, keep it predictable. Nobody was chasing a hero engine. They were chasing fewer unknowns. Only after that did the same mid-range name start surfacing, usually as a safe pick rather than a brag. The Mercury 94 stroke inline 4 is the kind of engine that does not win arguments on the internet, but it shows up in real ownership stories that do not end with a tow rope. In this horsepower class, boats are heavy enough to expose weak setups, but not so heavy that every run becomes a full throttle stress test. That matters because many engine problems begin as rigging problems and only become engine problems after months of being pushed too hard. Mechanics describe this motor as familiar, and that word carries weight. Familiar means a technician has seen the failure modes before, knows which symptoms are real, and knows which ones are just bad fuel or a tired battery pretending to be something bigger. Familiar also means parts and procedures exist everywhere, so the ownership experience is less likely to turn into a waiting game. When price came up, nobody pretended the market is fair. In many places, a clean used example still lives in the range of several thousand United States dollars, depending on hours and rigging. That is not proof it is perfect. It is proof people trusted enough to pay for it. And the most revealing line I heard was simple, not exciting, but dependable, which is exactly why the next pick is different. Not because it is flashy, but because it earns trust in a quieter, heavier way. Number 9, Honda 154 stroke. The conversation shifted from what starts every weekend to what stays stable after years of real use. That is where mechanics start thinking about heat cycles, corrosion, long service intervals, and engines that keep their manners as they age. You could hear the difference in their voices. This was no longer about convenience. This was about long-term confidence. Then, the Honda 150 four-stroke entered the discussion, and it usually came with a specific kind of respect. The respect you give to something that does not demand attention. Mechanics did not describe it as the fastest in its class. They described it as controlled, conservative, less interested in impressing you and more interested in staying out of trouble. What stood out was how often mechanics framed their praise as ownership behavior. They talked about these engines being chosen by owners who maintain them, store them correctly, and treat them like equipment instead of toys. That matters because engines are not just mechanical objects. They are mirrors of the habits around them. An engine that attracts careful owners often develops a reputation for living longer. And sometimes the reputation becomes a self-fulfilling loop. Hours came up, but the more honest mechanics refused to promise a magic number. Still, multiple people described seeing well-kept 150 horsepower Hondas cross into 4,000 hours without becoming constant visitors. That does not mean everyone will do it. It means the platform has a track record that makes mechanics less nervous when a customer says, "I want to keep this for a long time." The trade-offs were not hidden. Weight can affect how a hull sits. Dealer networks vary. Certain parts can be easier in some regions than others, but the tone was consistent. If you want an engine that behaves like it hates surprises, this is one of the safest personalities you can buy. That respect came with a pattern worth noticing. Engines that age well tend to attract owners who treat them carefully. Over time, the machine reflects the habits around it. That connection between behavior and longevity opened the door to a name from a different era, one that carries familiar hardware behind a quieter badge. Number 8, Mariner 115 two-stroke. Before anybody named an engine, they talked about a different kind of reliability, the kind that comes from being understood. Not understood by marketing, but understood by the ecosystem parts shelves, local knowledge, and the way a shop reacts when you limp in with a problem. That ecosystem is what determines whether a small issue stays small. That is why a legacy name kept surfacing in a way I did not expect. The Mariner 115. Two-stroke, especially the Yamaha-built eras, came up as a model that still earns trust in certain circles. Not because it is new, not because it is fashionable, but because it is mechanically familiar in a way that modern systems are not. Mechanics described a kind of straightforwardness that does not show up on spec sheets. Two-stroke engines in this era often feel more immediate, less layered, less dependent on stacked systems. That does not make them automatically better. It makes them easier to diagnose when something is wrong. And in the real world, diagnosis time is often the difference between a weekend saved and a season. Ruined. Some mechanics were careful here. They acknowledged that two-stroke legality and local rules can complicate ownership. Fuel practices matter. Storage matters. A neglected two-stroke can become a nightmare quickly, but when maintained correctly, this model often carries a reputation for being simple enough to keep alive without constantly chasing electronic ghosts. Value is another part of the story. Clean examples do not always sit for sale long. That does not prove anything by itself, but it suggests an appetite for engines that feel mechanical, rather than software-driven. Hearing that perspective changes how modern reliability gets defined. Familiarity begins to matter more than novelty. Diagnosis starts to matter more than innovation. Those priorities explain why the next pick stayed modern while resisting fragility, earning trust without demanding attention. So here's a question worth asking. Which outboard would you trust if downtime mattered more than speed? Drop that. Answer in the comments, especially if it came from experience rather than hype. Those patterns are where the real insight lives. And if this kind of slower, more honest breakdown is useful to you, like the video and subscribe. Number 7. Suzuki 144 stroke. The next set of answers did not begin with brand loyalty. They began with a feeling mechanics recognize instantly. An engine that sounds strained when a boat is loaded. That is the sound of stress. And stress is where problems grow. So when mechanics talk about a model being calm, they are not being poetic. They are describing how hard the engine has to work to do normal tasks. That is where the Suzuki 144 stroke kept appearing. It was rarely introduced with hype. It was introduced as a tool-strong torque, where you actually use it, stable behavior under load, and fewer surprise visits to the shop compared with some competitors in the same bracket. The praise was specific in a mechanic way. People described the engine as feeling understressed, meaning it is not constantly living at the edge of its capability. Engines that are not pushed to the edge tend to accumulate fewer heat-related issues, fewer intermittent failures, fewer almost problems that slowly become expensive. There were also comments about consistency across seasons. Not, it is perfect, but it keeps acting the same. That matters more than most buyers realize. When an engine's behavior changes, owners lose trust first, and then the expenses start. The Suzuki's reputation here was stability, not drama. No one pretended trade-offs do not exist. Dealer coverage depends on where you live. Resale hype varies. Some regions treat Suzuki like a secret, others treat it like an outsider. Mechanics were blunt. Resale matters if you plan to sell, but reliability matters if you plan to keep. That brings us to the point where this countdown gets sharper. Because after several safe, sensible picks, the mechanics started naming an engine that carries a stronger opinion, a bigger shadow, and a reputation that divides people. Not because it is weak, but because it is complicated in the way legends often are. Number 6. Evinrude Electronic Technology 150. At some point, the conversation stopped sounding like advice for customers and started sounding like confessions. That shift usually happens when a mechanic talks about engines they respect, even if they would never recommend them to everyone. Respect and recommendation are not the same thing. Respect is about engineering. Recommendation is about consequences. That is why the Evinrude Electronic Technology 150 showed up with such a strange mix of admiration and caution. The people who mentioned it tended to speak carefully, as if they knew the comment section would misunderstand them. They described strong torque, sharp response, and a design philosophy that felt genuinely different when it arrived. Cleaner running, less routine service in certain areas, and an identity that was not trying to copy every other four-stroke at the time. Then came the other side of the story. The same technology that makes it appealing can also make it unforgiving when something goes wrong. Mechanic opinions split here, but the pattern was consistent. When it is right, it is great. When it is wrong, it can become a hunt. Not always a catastrophic hunt, but a hunt that requires the right knowledge, the right parts, and sometimes the right technician. That creates a certain kind of ownership tension. Some owners love them because they feel special. Others swear never again because one bad season taught them what special can cost. Mechanics hinted at that without turning it into exaggeration. They did not need to. The mere fact that they spoke cautiously told you it has a real reputation. That tension lingered in the room. High performance leaves a shadow when ownership turns personal. After that moment, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Horsepower dropped. Expectations shifted. The next answer focused on survival rather than status. Number 5. Tohatsu 15 4-stroke. The tone changed the moment small boats entered the conversation. Not the kind shown in advertisements, running clean lines offshore, but the kind that live hard lives close to shore. Quick launches before sunrise, shallow ramps, muddy banks, frequent starts, short runs, long idles, engines lifted, tilted, bumped, strapped down, pulled off, put back on. In that environment, refinement matters far less than temperament. That was the context in which this motor kept surfacing. Rarely announced, rarely praised loudly. Mechanics talked around it first, describing a role rather than a brand. Something light enough to handle easily, strong enough to push a loaded skiff without complaint, forgiving enough to tolerate imperfect fuel, rushed maintenance, rough handling. Only after that description, settled, would the same answer appear, almost casually, like admitting a routine rather than making a recommendation. What stood out was how often the conversation returned to access. Access to components, access to answers, access to fixes that do not spiral. Mechanics spoke about designs that leave space to work, systems that explain themselves quickly, problems that show their cause without demanding hours of guesswork. That kind of clarity changes ownership psychology. Small problems stay small. Decisions stay calm. Several mechanics described this motor as honest, using the word without irony. Honest means it does not disguise trouble behind layers of software. Honest means the engine tells you what it needs, through sound, behavior, response. Honest means repairs feel finite, rather than open-ended. In a professional environment, that distinction matters. In personal ownership, it matters even more. Cost entered the discussion quietly, not as a bargain claim, not as a comparison chart, but as a feeling, a sense that the money spent up front often feels lighter over time. Fewer unexpected failures, fewer expensive surprises, fewer moments where a simple outing turns into a logistical problem. Mechanics hinted that owners rarely talk about these engines online because nothing dramatic happens. No horror stories, no miracles, just use. There was also a subtle point about respect. Engines like this earn trust through repetition rather than reputation. They keep starting. They keep running. They keep tolerating lives that look nothing like ideal ownership scenarios. That builds confidence quietly, one season at a time. Reliability at this scale changes expectations. Convenience fades. Durability takes priority. Engines stop being evaluated by features and start being judged by how they behave after years of imperfect use. That shift naturally pulls attention toward designs that existed before complexity became the default, where simplicity was not a philosophy but a necessity. Number 4, Johnson 15 2-stroke. The next pick started with a memory. Engines that feel mechanical enough that you can explain them without a screen. That is not nostalgia for its own sake. It is a reaction to modern complexity. When you live inside repairs, you start appreciating designs that have fewer mystery layers. That is why the Johnson 15 2-stroke showed up as a distinct own money answer. Not as a best engine ever, but as a tool that still earns respect in the places where it is still allowed, still supported and still kept clean. Mechanics talked about it like something you buy when you want lightweight power and straightforward behavior, especially for smaller hulls, where weight matters more than people admit. They also spoke carefully about the realities. Age matters, condition matters, and two-stroke ownership depends on how you fuel and store. A clean Johnson 15 is not the same thing as a tired one with unknown history. One is a dependable tool. The other is a project that may never tell you the full truth until it strands you at the worst time. Value came up in a subtle way. Certain legacy engines hold their place because replacement is not straightforward. New engines are cleaner but heavier. New engines are modern but more layered. When buyers feel overwhelmed by complexity, they begin paying attention to what feels simple and proven. Nobody claimed these engines will stay desirable forever. Rules change. Supply dries up. The market shifts. But the fact that mechanics still mention it tells you something. If an engine keeps being named decades later, it earned that place through patterns, not hype. Legacy choices raise uncomfortable questions. Simplicity still holds value. Complexity keeps expanding. Somewhere between those realities sits an engine most buyers overlook, despite strong respect among people who see long-term patterns. Number 3. Nissan Marine 204-stroke. The next. Answers were framed around workload, not casual trips, but heavy boats, long runs, and the kind of usage that reveals whether an engine is truly comfortable doing its job. Mechanics in that mindset care less about headlines and more about what survives year after year without turning into an expensive story. That is where Nissan Marine's 204-stroke surfaced as a surprisingly respected pick. It is not a brand that dominates conversation now, which is exactly why it works so well in this list. Mechanics who mentioned it often did so with the same tone. You would be surprised how solid these can be when you understand what you are looking at. In many cases, these engines were built in partnership with manufacturers whose designs already had a reputation for toughness. That does not guarantee perfection, and mechanics did not claim it does. What they emphasized was practical ownership, parts that are not impossible, systems that are not needlessly dramatic, and an engine that tends to behave consistently when maintained. The quiet appeal is that it can feel like an insider's engine, not because it is secret, but because it is overlooked by people who only shop the biggest names. When something is overlooked, the market sometimes prices it more reasonably. That can create opportunities for owners who value function over status. There are risks, and they were not hidden. Support networks vary. Documentation can be thinner depending on the year. The wrong seller can turn quiet bargain into hard-to-source headache. But in the hands of an owner who does their homework, mechanics suggested this can be one of those engines that surprises you by simply doing its job. And that sets up the next chapter, because after a pick like this, the list needs an engine that brings the conversation back to modern realities, new technology, new pricing, and the uncomfortable question of what ownership looks like when complexity becomes the norm. Next is the one that feels modern, yet still leaves room for debate. Number 2. Selva Dorado 204-stroke. The next chapter begins with a tension that is spreading across boating. Modern engines are getting better, but also more layered. More sensors, more systems, more ways for small issues to trigger big behaviors. That does not automatically mean they are worse. It means ownership becomes more dependent on the ecosystem around you. That is where the Selva Dorado 204-stroke becomes an interesting mechanic answer. It is not the most common badge in many regions, which is exactly why the people who do mention it tend to have a reason. The appeal is not just horsepower, it is the way the engine fits into a certain kind of ownership logic. Modern performance, without trying to be a rolling experiment. Mechanics framed it as a capable, real-world option that can surprise people who assume only the biggest global names matter. In some cases, Selva engines have shared lineage with platforms that already proved themselves in other markets. That kind of lineage matters because it suggests the engine is not built from scratch, with unknown long-term patterns. But here is where the grounded speculation lives. The badge is not as widely discussed, which means fewer public stories, fewer online known fixes, and less crowdsourced troubleshooting. That can be fine if you have strong local support. It can be stressful if you do not. Mechanics did not give a universal verdict. They treated it like a smart pick in the right conditions. That conditional trust is the entire point of this countdown. Mechanics are not saying, buy this no matter what. They are saying, this is what I would do if I knew my situation. Conditional trust defined the final stretch. Predictability became the currency. The last answer surfaced without drama, without suspense, without surprise. It arrived the same way it earned its place. Number 1, Yamaha 154 stroke. The final answer did not arrive as a dramatic reveal. It arrived like a conclusion. When the question becomes personal, your boat, your money, your downtime, mechanics stop chasing interesting and start chasing predictable. They fear expensive mysteries more than they fear boring ownership. That mindset is why the Yamaha 154 stroke sits at the top as the most repeatable own money choice. The reputation here is not built on internet arguments. It is built on patterns, parts that show up, service knowledge that runs deep, and a platform with problems that are known rather than random. Known is an underrated kind of reliability. Known means you can plan. It means the fix is documented. It means the repair does not turn into a guessing game. Mechanics described it as a reference point. When something fails on another engine, the comparison becomes, this is why people still trust this one. When a buyer is anxious, the comfort becomes, at least we know what we are dealing with. That is not fanboy talk. That is risk management. It is not flawless, and nobody honest pretends it is. The point is that its weaknesses are more visible, more understood, and less likely to surprise you at the worst time. In a market where complexity keeps increasing, that predictability becomes a form of value. And the quiet twist of this whole countdown is that the shocking part was never a secret miracle engine. The shock was how often mechanics chose certainty over hype, and how often the smartest choices were the ones that never needed to scream for attention. If this changed how you think about the best outboard, that is the real takeaway. Reliability is not a claim, it is a pattern. These picks were not about what wins on paper. They were about what feels survivable after years of real ownership, parts, diagnosis, downtime, and repair exposure. And if you want the follow-up, the next chapter is the uncomfortable one. The popular engines mechanics respect, but quietly avoid owning once the warranty clock runs out. If this gave you a clearer look at the outboard world, subscribe. More real outboard truth is coming.